In 2002, 6-year-old Micah Reeves was adopted through a private foster placement in Ohio. The paperwork was clean. The case was closed. But when the state did a routine follow-up 2 years later, the family was gone. No forwarding address, no withdrawal notice, just an empty house, a full mailbox, and a file that said finalized. No one reported Micah missing, because on paper, he didn't exist anymore. For nearly 2 decades, the case was buried under bureaucratic silence, until a state records audit in 2021 pulled one forgotten document from a storage box, and with it, a trail of names that would lead to one of the most disturbing foster care cover-ups in Ohio history. The house at 1842 Nellis Lane looked like any other on the block. Beige siding, plastic shutters, a sagging mailbox with peeling white paint. Nothing about it stood out, except for the fact that no one had opened that mailbox in months. Teresa Holt, a compliance specialist with Ohio Child Services, stood on the porch with a clipboard and the wrong kind of silence. She'd come for a routine home verification on a finalized adoption from 2002, the Reeves placement. But everything about the house felt like a space abandoned quietly, not lived in naturally. There was no car in the driveway, no porch furniture, no answer at the door. She waited 15 minutes, then walked the perimeter. A gate was unlatched. A garden hose had been left coiled in the grass. Through the back window, she saw a kitchen, stripped bare. No magnets on the fridge, no chairs around the table. The file in her hand listed 2 adoptive parents, Walter and Patricia Hammond, both in their early 40s. The child, Micah Reeves, had entered state custody in 2001 after a series of neglect complaints against his biological mother. No criminal history, no drugs, just instability. The Hammonds had taken him in as a foster placement that fall, and the adoption had been finalized the next November. Caseworker at the time, Donald Riggins. Placement agency, St. Joseph's Family Services. There were no incident flags, no alerts, just a simple form signed and stamped, finalized, closed. But now, 2 years later, there was no sign of the child, no trace of the parents, and, as Teresa would learn over the following weeks, no record that Micah Reeves had ever enrolled in school, visited a pediatrician, or filed for a state ID. She returned to the office that afternoon and requested updated contact information for the Hammonds. There wasn't any. She called the placement agency. They said the file had been archived. She asked to speak with the caseworker of record. "We don't have a Donald Riggins in the system anymore," the receptionist said. Teresa paused. "Do you have a forwarding email or phone?" The line went quiet. Then, "He left a while back. No contact listed." The case was flagged for rescheduling, but no follow-up was filed. And within a week, the house at 1842 Nellis Lane was foreclosed. The property changed hands. The mailbox was removed. The files were boxed. And just like that, Micah Reeves, 6 years old, legally adopted, name changed, was gone. Not reported missing. Not flagged as endangered. Just erased. In 2021, the Ohio Office of Child Services began a state-mandated audit of all finalized adoptions between 1995 and 2010. The project was meant to be procedural, a political gesture following a mishandled custody case that made headlines. Thousands of records were pulled from off-site storage. Most were scanned, logged, and boxed again without incident. But on June 2nd, a temporary data analyst named Kendra Ung was entering scanned adoption records from the 2002 batch when she noticed something odd. One file, stamped as finalized, had no accompanying court docket number. The PDF was clean, but the metadata was missing its source tag. Curious, she pulled the original paper version from the physical box. It was the adoption file for a boy named Micah Reeves. There were no school forms, no medical attachments, no follow-up compliance records. The only documentation included a placement form, a short home study summary, and a single page with a signature. Judge Alvin Bracknell, November 2002. No court stamp, no case ID, no attached transcript. Kendra flagged it for secondary review and kept scanning. The next morning, the record was gone. When she checked the shared audit drive, the Micah Reeves folder had been deleted. No user history. No trace. It was as if it had never been uploaded. She mentioned it to her supervisor in passing, who dismissed it as a likely duplicate or error. But Kendra couldn't stop thinking about the missing docket number. Every other file had one, even the flawed cases. Why didn't this? She mentioned it later that week to a friend who worked in the Bureau of Family Integrity, a small oversight division nested within the Ohio Department of Health and Human Services. The friend ran a casual search. Nothing on Micah Reeves, no educational file, no public benefits record, no juvenile ID ever issued. What she did find was a closed adoption under the name Jalen Carter, finalized 1 week earlier. Same birth date, same county, no attached photo. That was enough to flag the case for review. And quietly, without triggering a public alert, the file was rerouted for internal investigation. It would take 3 more weeks and 2 more near misses before anyone realized the same caseworker had handled both files, and that he no longer existed in the state payroll system. The Bureau of Family Integrity operated out of a converted municipal building 2 blocks from the state capitol. Most of its work involved oversight memos and low-level fraud audits, rarely anything urgent, and almost never anything involving disappearances. But by mid-July, the Micah Reeves case was circulating quietly among senior analysts. What set it apart wasn't just the missing data. It was the fact that 2 adoption records existed for what appeared to be the same child, with different names, birth certificates, and parental signatures. The social security numbers were off by 1 digit. The caseworker listed in both files, Donald Riggins, had no forwarding information, no retirement record, and no official separation date from St. Joseph's Family Services. His personnel file simply ended in 2004. The agency that had handled the placements, St. Joseph's, had long since dissolved, acquired, renamed, folded into a larger umbrella organization. The original paper files had been shipped to a private record storage facility in Franklin County, where they were supposed to be digitized and uploaded to the state system. But when investigators requested access to the physical boxes, they were told the files had been marked destroyed in 2012 during a records purge. No chain of custody, no scan logs, just a red stamp. Destroyed. The only surviving trace of the Micah file came from a single paper printout, not from the adoption itself, but from an address verification submitted in 2003 to a third-party housing program. It listed a foster stipend connected to the Reeves file, paid to a Patricia Hammond for a residence on Nellis Lane. That address, too, no longer existed. The original house had been demolished in 2006 after a fire gutted the interior. No investigation had been launched. The fire had been ruled electrical. The property had been purchased 3 years later by a real estate investment firm. No known link to the Hammonds. No remaining records of the child, except one. In the Franklin County intake log, buried in a miscellaneous folder that had somehow escaped the purge, was a returned envelope. Postmarked January 2004, mailed to the Nellis Lane address. The label was standard, request for annual compliance update. Scrawled in blue ink on the front, in careful block letters, were 5 words. No one by that name. No signature, no forwarding address, no return explanation. Just a message, written on a state-issued envelope, returned to a system that had already marked the case closed. The investigation moved slowly, quietly. There was no public bulletin, no missing persons report. No one wanted to trigger press scrutiny over a case that, on paper, had been closed for nearly 20 years. But by early August, the Bureau had compiled enough irregularities to warrant an internal task review. 3 more cases emerged, all processed between 2001 and 2004. All with the same signature, Donald Riggins. Each involved a finalized adoption of a child between the ages of 5 and 7. Each child disappeared from the system within 18 months of placement. Each family listed as adoptive parents had no verified tax history, utility accounts, or employment verification after the adoption date. And all 4 children, including Micah, had undergone name changes within 30 days of finalization. It wasn't fraud. It wasn't even illegal, not strictly. But the pattern was too clean, too precise. It suggested orchestration, not error. Then came the break. A retired investigator named Donnie Kellerman, who had worked for the Ohio Office of Protective Services in the late 90s, reached out after hearing quiet rumblings about a resurfaced adoption file. He had handled 2 cases in 2003 involving children who had been adopted, vanished, and whose records had mysteriously been scrubbed from the state database. One involved a girl named Ania Cross. The other, a boy named Tomasz Beal. Neither child was ever reported missing. But Kellerman still had a box of photocopied records from the investigation. Old habit. In one of them was a scanned image of a feedback form from a home visit attempt at an address listed under Westlake Holdings LLC, a property management company that had leased homes in low-income areas across Northeast Ohio. Written in the margin of that form, almost invisible beneath the copier smudge, was a note in faded pen. Child not observed. Caretaker stated, "He's gone by another name now." The name on the form? Donald Riggins. The signature matched every adoption file. And the leasing address was 3 miles from Nellis Lane. Riggins wasn't just signing off on placements. He was physically present, for at least 2 of them. And none of the children placed under his supervision were ever heard from again. The Bureau moved to subpoena archived financial records from the Westlake Holdings leasing company, but the paper trail hit a wall. The business had dissolved in 2007, and its parent entity, a Delaware-registered shell firm, had no physical office, no employees, and no identifiable owners. The only recurring name on its property leases was a low-level paralegal named Andrew Crickson, who had signed housing agreements on behalf of various tenants. When investigators contacted Crickson, he claimed to have no memory of the specific properties in question. He had worked for a firm that processed hundreds of anonymous housing contracts each year, mostly for transitional clients or unregistered care arrangements. It was legal, barely. But one thing he did remember was a placement on Nellis Lane. The contract, he said, had been unusual, filed through a third-party courier instead of a verified tenant. He described the man who dropped off the paperwork as nervous, formal, and oddly dressed, like someone pretending to be social services. When shown a photograph of Donald Riggins, Crickson nodded. "That's the guy." Or, "Someone who looked exactly like him." That confirmation was enough to justify a limited reclassification. Internally, the state now considered Micah Reeves a Category 4 inactive missing minor, a designation reserved for children whose legal status cannot be confirmed due to destroyed or fraudulent documentation. The state could not officially list him as missing, because technically there was no record that he had ever existed. But investigators kept digging. They rechecked the county storage lot where the Reeves envelope had been recovered. One clerk remembered the name from a batch of misfiled intake documents that had been incorrectly routed during the 2012 scan purge. Most had been shredded, but a few had been archived in a forgotten metal cabinet slated for disposal. Inside that cabinet was a water-damaged folder, nearly unreadable from humidity. It contained a single intake form from July 2001. The child listed was Jalen Carter, 6 years old, removed from maternal custody in Cleveland, placed under emergency foster care. The intake photo showed a small boy with a birthmark on his right clavicle, and handwritten on the upper corner, in faint red ink, to be transferred to Patricia Hammond, pending name change. It was the same birthmark noted in the medical notes of Micah Reeves. Same boy, 2 names, 1 erased, and the final note at the bottom of the form, barely legible through the water stains, read, "Final ID to be processed by D. Riggins. Hold file for physical signature." There was no second page, no fingerprint card, no medical transfer, just that line, and a file that should have been destroyed. Instead, it had sat in the dark for nearly 20 years, waiting. The file's rediscovery triggered a quiet surge within the Bureau. For the first time, there was physical, documented evidence that a child had been processed under 2 identities, and that someone within the system had orchestrated it. A task force was formed. The paper trail was reconstructed, fragile piece by fragile piece. The placement to Patricia Hammond was real. The stipend payments were real. But the legal finalization was never officially recorded by the court. Judge Alvin Bracknell, whose signature had appeared on multiple adoption files tied to Riggins, had passed away in 2010. His archived logs contained no docket entries for Micah Reeves or Jalen Carter. That left one possibility. The finalization forms were forged. The signature, lifted from a different case, altered with a photocopy overlay, then printed onto adoption letters processed through an off-books courier system. It was elaborate, sloppy, but just clean enough to slip through. The forgery linked 5 closed adoption cases between 2000 and 2004. Each child disappeared after placement. In October 2021, under direct authorization from the State Attorney General's office, investigators obtained a court order to access sealed financial disclosures from St. Joseph's Family Services just before its acquisition. Buried in a line item under Transitional Contract Reimbursements was a string of checks paid out to an entity listed as CCB Developmental Trust, an unlicensed private provider with no child services credentials. 3 of those checks were signed by Donald Riggins. One of them, for $1,850, was issued exactly 1 week after Micah Reeves was placed at 1842 Nellis Lane. That amount matched the monthly foster stipend at the time. The trust, it turned out, was a pass-through account. It had been closed in 2005, and the bank had since merged. But an old employee from the records department remembered the account. She remembered it because of an unusual transfer. A withdrawal of exactly $7,400, 4 months' worth of payments, made in cash, with a signature that looked like it had been written slowly, deliberately, as if by someone copying letters they didn't normally use. The account was closed the same day, and the only remaining document attached to that closure was a scanned copy of a driver's license belonging to a woman named Patricia Hammond. The photo was grainy. The ID number didn't exist in the BMV database, and the face in the photo wasn't a woman. It was a man wearing a wig, and underneath the signature box, just barely visible, issued 2002, Cuyahoga County. They ran the image through facial recognition. The match came back in under 3 hours. The photo wasn't just anyone. It was Donald Riggins. By November 2021, the task force had what they needed to classify the investigation as criminal. What had started as a routine audit had become a covert inquiry into a decades-old network of fraudulent placements. And at the center of it was a man who had vanished from official employment records in 2004 left behind no digital footprint and whose death had never been reported. Donald Riggins hadn't died. He had disappeared. The facial recognition hit led investigators to an address in western Pennsylvania, a small, dilapidated property outside Erie registered under a pseudonym, Walter D. Hannon. Public utilities were active, no employment listed. Neighbors described the man who lived there as reclusive, older, rarely left the house. On November 16th, federal agents approached the home. Riggins answered the door. He didn't resist, didn't ask questions. He simply said, "I wondered when someone would finally come." In the house, investigators found a locked filing cabinet. Inside were over 40 documents, handwritten notes, intake summaries, outdated placement records. Most had been removed from circulation decades earlier. Some were marked with initials, payment amounts, and notations in red pen. Reassigned, closed, held, no re-entry. But the real discovery was in the basement. Behind a sheet of plastic nailed to a support beam was a sealed container. Inside, dozens of undeveloped rolls of film, each labeled with dates between 2001 and 2005. The photos, when developed, revealed images of children, all posed in front of houses, many of them unfurnished, some appearing in more than one photo with different clothing or different adults beside them. The same boy appeared 3 times, same eyes, same posture. In one photo, he stood next to a mailbox with the numbers 1842 partially obscured. In another, he sat on the floor beside a crate labeled Jalen. In the third, he looked directly at the camera, holding a small red object in his hands, a toy car, still in its packaging, with a price sticker from a discount pharmacy chain that had closed in 2004. One of the agents recognized the boy from the intake photo. It was Micah. Older, maybe 7, still alive at the time the photo was taken. But that's where the trail stopped. There were no more recent images, no school records, no death certificate, no confirmed identity. When questioned, Riggins refused to speak for the first 48 hours. Then, without prompting, he delivered a single statement. They were always supposed to be temporary. That was the agreement. He never clarified who they were, or who he meant by the agreement, or what happened to the children, the ones never returned, the ones no one else ever knew to look for. Riggins was charged with obstruction of state records, fraud, and multiple counts of endangering the welfare of a child. But with no living victims formally identified, prosecutors struggled to press for anything beyond document crimes. No bodies had been found, no definitive proof of harm, just erasure. The children in the photographs were listed as unverified identities, pending trace. The photos were released quietly to interstate child welfare agencies under a sealed, multi-jurisdictional task force, hoping to generate matches against old intake forms or missing persons bulletins. 3 weeks later, a tentative hit came from a shelter intake form filed in Indiana in 2006. A boy, estimated to be around 10, had entered the system under the name Sean P. after being found alone outside a convenience store. No family, no prior records. He stayed in the shelter for 2 months before being moved into emergency foster placement. The case was closed in 2009 when the boy was adopted by a private family in rural Illinois. He had been known as quiet, withdrawn, prone to nightmares. His adoption records were clean. His new name wasn't shared. But one intake photo from 2006 bore a striking resemblance to the child from the Nellis Lane photographs. The boy had a small birthmark below his collarbone. A court order was filed for a voluntary DNA test. The adoptive family, now fully informed of the situation, agreed. The test matched the birth DNA sample filed for Jalen Carter in 2001. Micah Reeves had survived. He was alive, 26 years old, living under a different name, unaware of the scandal that had once defined his early life. He declined to speak publicly. His statement to the Bureau was brief, delivered through an attorney. He did not remember the Hammonds. He did not remember being called Micah. What he did remember, he said, was a white house with brown carpet, a woman who called herself Mom, and a room with no windows. He remembered being told not to go outside, not to answer the door, not to talk about where he came from. And then one day, no one came home. He waited. He got hungry. He left. He remembered walking for what felt like days, sleeping behind dumpsters, waiting for someone to ask him his name, but no one did. So he made one up. When the investigators asked what he wanted to happen now, he said, "I want the file closed. I want to move on. That's all." He had no interest in pressing charges, no desire to open the past, no plans to pursue restitution. He had a job, a quiet life, and a family of his own. He had survived something he never fully understood. And that, he said, was enough. The state officially reclassified the Reeves case as resolved survivor located. No other children in the photographs have been definitively identified. Donald Riggins died in custody 6 months later. Natural causes. No known next of kin. The boxes in his basement were sealed and entered into federal evidence. Most remain unprocessed. And the house on Nellis Lane, long since demolished, is now just a parcel number on a county tax map. Flattened, erased, paved over. Like so many others. After the case was reclassified, a quiet internal review was launched within the Ohio Department of Child Services. Not to celebrate the resolution, but to trace how it had been buried for so long. A panel of former caseworkers, supervisors, and compliance officers was assembled. Most had never heard of the Riggins files. Some remembered his name vaguely. One recalled him as methodical, closed off, always on time. No one remembered ever being in his home. No one could say who trained him. The personnel file from his hiring in 1999 had no references listed. His application had been handwritten, submitted in person, and approved within a week. The HR director who signed off had retired in 2003. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Riggins had been quietly operating outside normal oversight channels for at least 4 years. He filed just enough documentation to keep each case alive, just enough paper to justify each stipend, and just enough distance to make his placements appear normal, until the children vanished. Of the 5 known cases traced to him, only Micah, Jalen, was ever found. The others remain names on forms, unmatched photos in folders. One girl, noted only as A. Cross, was linked to a placement address in Euclid, Ohio. When investigators visited the property, now abandoned, they found a rusted mailbox with a nameplate still bolted to the inside, the Cross family. There were no census records, no forwarding address, no tax history. A neighbor remembered a little girl who stayed inside all summer, but not her name. The panel submitted a 78-page report to the state attorney general, outlining procedural vulnerabilities and failure points in the foster placement system between 1998 and 2005. The language was bureaucratic, careful. It didn't mention Micah by name. It didn't name Riggins directly. And it never used the word missing. Just a single paragraph at the end, quietly inserted into the conclusion. Due to documentation irregularities and incomplete oversight practices, we cannot definitively determine the outcomes of multiple child placements facilitated during this period. In such cases, record destruction, whether intentional or administrative, may have resulted in the permanent loss of critical information. Future systems must account for these blind spots. We recommend no public statement be made at this time. The file was marked closed, internal only. And like the house, like the envelope, like the name, it vanished into storage. No press release was ever issued. Micah's real name, his legal identity, was never disclosed to the media. There was no photo, no boy found headline, no follow-up story in the Cleveland Plain Dealer or Columbus Dispatch. The case was deemed administratively resolved and filed under Archival Status Code 6403. Investigation concluded, no further action. Behind the scenes, however, two agencies quietly began cross-referencing missing persons cases from 2000 to 2006 against the photographs recovered in Riggins' basement. The FBI's Child ID program took possession of digital scans. A short internal memo, not meant for public release, noted that several images may correlate to unidentified juvenile remains recovered in southern Ohio and Pennsylvania between 2003 and 2008. No matches have been confirmed. No new victims have been named. But one image, file hash 17B, depicts a young girl, estimated age 6 to 8, wearing a yellow dress and holding a plastic lunch tray in what appears to be a basement kitchenette. Behind her, a calendar shows the month of March 2004. The location has not been identified. The file remains open. The investigator who filed the final Micah Reeves report declined to speculate publicly. But in a quiet email to colleagues, she wrote, "We didn't find a person. We found a hole, and someone who crawled out of it." To this day, no definitive explanation exists for how Riggins circumvented so many layers of oversight. No full accounting of who else may have been involved. No charges filed against anyone beyond him. And no mechanism has been put in place to ensure those exact steps couldn't be repeated. Micah, or Jalen, has not spoken to law enforcement since the DNA confirmation. He has not returned calls, letters, or interview requests. His family declined relocation assistance and declined entry into the Federal Victims Registry. The only thing he allowed to be shared was a short, handwritten line, unsigned, unaddressed, sent in an envelope with no return. "I don't want to remember what came before, but I want someone to remember that I was here." It remains the final note in the file, and perhaps the most important one. In the years since the case was closed, the Reeves file has become something of a ghost document within the Bureau, referenced in ethics trainings, cited in internal memos, but never spoken of publicly. It exists in the system as a sealed example, a warning. Proof that disappearance doesn't always begin with violence. Sometimes it begins with paperwork, with a signature, a quiet transfer, a destroyed envelope, a clerk who never asked why a 6-year-old vanished from school rolls without triggering a single alert. What made the case so difficult and so deeply disturbing wasn't just the disappearance itself. It was how easily the system allowed it. How many thresholds had to be crossed for a child to become untraceable. Not once, but repeatedly. The photographs found in the basement are still under review. Some show homes that have since been demolished. Some feature adults whose identities remain unconfirmed. Most of the children are unidentified. The state has since implemented new audit procedures, modern case tracking, biometric record keeping. But no one is certain how many others, like Micah, never made it back into the system. In interviews, the investigators who worked the Reeves case often refer to it in code: the Ghost File, 1842, the Backdoor Series, a shorthand for something they saw too late. One of them, a senior analyst who has since retired, said it best in a deposition for a separate inquiry. He wasn't missing. He was misplaced, by design, and we didn't notice because the file told us not to. Micah's location remains known only to the Bureau. He has not been contacted again. And the others, the ones in the photos, the ones with half names and no birthday on file, remain undocumented, unsearched for, forgotten. All except for one photograph still taped to a locked evidence drawer. A boy, maybe 7, standing in front of a mailbox with the numbers 1842, holding a plastic-wrapped toy, staring directly at the camera, and beneath it, handwritten in ink, no one by that name. That photograph is now part of a sealed archive housed in an unlisted facility within Ohio's Evidence Retention Division. It's not public, it's not cataloged, but every new analyst assigned to Child Services Oversight is shown a scan of that image on their first day. Not as part of training, as part of orientation. They're told the boy's name was Micah Reeves, that he was adopted in 2002, that he vanished in 2004, and that he was found, but not rescued. Found, but too late for any restitution, any justice, any real explanation. They're told that no one reported him missing, not because no one cared, but because no one was allowed to know he existed. And if one temporary audit hire hadn't flagged a missing docket number in a box of scanned PDFs in 2021, he would still be gone. Not dead. Just deleted. This is what remains. A boy who walked out of a locked house, not knowing if he was abandoned or freed. A man who forged signatures and moved money through a trust account registered to a false name. A photograph. A missing name. And a question that no investigation could answer. How many other children were erased and never walked back out? There is no memorial for the children lost in the paper trail. No plaques, no gravestones, no registry of vanished names that were never entered in the first place. Just a quiet file folder in a locked drawer and a few surviving copies of an audit report that almost didn't get written. The state never released a number, never published a list. In public records, the Riggins case is referenced only as Legacy Placement Irregularities, 2001, 2004. 4 words that now stand in for a cluster of missing lives. At conferences, some social services officials reference it obliquely, a cautionary tale about data reform, oversight gaps, or early 2000s software limitations. But none of those terms capture the full truth. Because what happened wasn't just about oversight. It was about intent. Someone chose to move those files. Someone chose to rename those children. Someone chose to destroy the paper trail that made them traceable. And for years it worked. Until one record surfaced, one return envelope, one child's face in a photo that no one was supposed to keep. One analyst who asked a question that wasn't on her checklist. Micah's story ends without fanfare. He is still alive by all accounts, still living under his adopted name, still choosing silence over spectacle. The state honors that, quietly, privately, without calling it a success. Because in a case like this, resolution does not mean justice. It just means someone was found, not explained, not healed, just found. And in that small, incomplete fact, the record finally closes. But the rest remain. And every time someone opens that drawer and looks at the photograph, the one with the boy standing beside the mailbox, holding the red toy, the same question is asked again, quietly, as if it might change something now. Who else did we never look for? That question still lingers across agencies, not as policy, but as atmosphere. It appears in the margins of case reviews, in whispers during hallway conversations, in moments of pause when an adoption file comes up with too few attachments. Most of the time, it passes. The systems are cleaner now, safer. But no system is perfect. And the problem with disappearance is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't start with screams or break-ins or shattered windows. It starts with silence, a line unchecked, a visit postponed, a child not photographed after intake, a signature scanned instead of stamped. The people who worked Micah's case carry it quietly. Some still call him by the name on the old intake file. Some keep a copy of the calendar photo in their drawer, the one where the month is frozen on March 2004, behind a girl who was never named. She has not been found. No next of kin, no matching dental records, just a photo and a birth year written in pencil. The Ohio Bureau stopped investigating Riggins-related placements in 2023. The decision was administrative: budget, jurisdiction, statute limits. But the drawer is still there. The case IDs are still active. And the boy in the picture, Micah, Jalen, or whatever name he carries now, is still out there, living. Not as a case file, not as a story, but as a reminder that even when the system forgets, someone might remember. Even when the paper is shredded, a copy might survive. Even when no one goes looking, a door might still open. And that every missing child, even the ones we didn't know to name, leaves behind a question the state can't answer. How many others are still waiting to be found? There are no final answers in the Micah Reeves case, only final documents. A reclassified file, a sealed drawer, a redacted memo that never reached the public, and one photo, taken on a disposable camera nearly 2 decades ago, of a child no one was supposed to remember. The forensic team who analyzed Riggins' records still debates how deep the scheme really went, whether he acted alone or was part of something larger, whether other names, other placements were buried deeper under different aliases in states that haven't audited their archives. But there is no funding for those searches, no political will, no families filing lawsuits. The children he handled had no one left to advocate for them because in the eyes of the law, they had already been given homes. And that was supposed to be enough. It wasn't. For Micah, survival was not rescue. It was quiet endurance, a life rebuilt on a foundation of missing years and unanswered questions. And for the investigators who found him, there is no victory. Only a grim acknowledgement that they arrived too late for everything except the paperwork. When the final review was submitted in 2024, it included one last note, buried deep in the appendix. Recommended future audit intervals every 15 years. Priority, medium. Risk category, historical anomaly. Name of subject, redacted. That redaction says more than any resolution ever could. Because even now, after all the files have been boxed and numbered and shelved, no one is certain whether Micah was the only one who made it out. The rest? They're still just gaps in records, in memory, in the system that swore it would protect them. And somewhere in a quiet town, under a different name, the boy who once stood beside a mailbox and held a red toy in his hand now walks through life with no traceable past. Except for one thing: the mark the system left on him by trying to erase him. The mark that proves he was here. And the final question that still hasn't gone away: if the system can erase a child completely, who else is missing that we never even knew to look for? That question, unspoken, unanswered, is the one that never left the room. It hung in the air during every closed-door meeting, echoed in the silence between file pages, lingered behind every blurred face in the photographs no one could match. The task force disbanded quietly. The analysts were reassigned, the documents sealed. Micah's name no longer appears in any public system. His DNA is tagged under a closed classification, accessible only with federal override. His case is used in training now, not as a lesson in survival, but in systems failure. Because this wasn't a kidnapping. There were no ransom notes, no Amber Alerts, No search dogs or news conferences. Micah wasn't stolen. He was processed. Through doors that were supposed to lead to safety. Through hands that signed his name into oblivion. Through a system that believed as long as there was a file, there was a child. But sometimes the file lies. Sometimes the file is the disappearance. And even now, years later, the question still surfaces. Whenever an adoption record is missing a school enrollment, whenever a foster payment has no accompanying health check, whenever a child's name appears once, and then never again. It's not just, where did they go? It's, was there even anyone looking? The story ends with Micah alive, but unrecognizable to the system that once claimed to save him. The others, the ones with initials, half faces, no birth dates, remain sealed behind digital silence. And somewhere, someone still knows more. A name, a photo, a memory that never made it into the file. Maybe they think it doesn't matter anymore, that too much time has passed. But time doesn't erase children. It only hides them, until someone decides to look again.